always believed in miracles.
Greater protection for people of religious faith.
Every single proposal for protection of religious freedoms was voted down today.
I think the coalition is facing a tough sell on this bill over the next few months, and that's because church leaders want religious freedom protection.
Are we going to impose more threats and violence on our streets if we give that religious freedom to an ideology that I believe is political?
Without religious liberty, we are doomed.
Ban the burqa in Australia.
The first serious bit of legislation that the new government puts into this parliament is for the most radical abortion laws in this country.
Go and buy some non-halal Easter eggs and chocolate and have a happy Easter, everyone.
Leaders, as we've seen in recent times, come and go, but I think the faith hopefully is forever.
We are an amazing country of amazing people. God bless Australia.
Hello and welcome to Faith and Politics. I'm your host, Reverend Jag Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. Faith and Politics is the latest podcast produced by the Order of Knight George. For those who don't know, the Order of Knight George is an Australian Lutheran media ministry. We have a website, we do podcasts, we do videos, we do books, we do papers, sermons, we do a whole range of things. If you're interested in what we do, you can find us on our website, www.knightgeorge.info, or just search the Order of Knight George on YouTube, iTunes, or SoundCloud, and you'll be able to find all our audio and visual content there. So, Faith and Politics is the latest podcast I've decided to do. This is a podcast where I interview different Australian politicians regarding their faith and their politics and how those two are connected. And so for my very first Faith and Politics episode, I have Queensland politician George Christensen. George, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thanks very much, Reverend Jake, and it's great to be on your show, on your podcast, for the first podcast of Faith and Politics. As you've said, my name is George Christensen. I'm a politician from Queensland, but I'm in the federal parliament. I represent an area, an electorate called Dawson, which covers a fair chunk of North Queensland. It's 400 kilometres from one end to the other. I live in Mackay, and the electorate goes from Mackay right up to Townsville, so takes in areas like the Whitsundays, Bowen, the Burdekin, a lot of rural territory, but a lot of tourism country as well. My background has been in journalism mainly before I got into politics, and I studied journalism at university. I went into journalism straight out of university, worked in that for a while, then worked actually for a politician doing their press secretary work. I went and started my own newspaper company for a while. I became a local government councillor at the same time, and then got elected to federal parliament back in 2010. Along with all of that, I've had a keen interest in theology and matters of spirituality, and I've just recently graduated with a graduate diploma of theology, and I'm probably going to go on and do a master's in theology as well.
And you mentioned you're a federal member, so that means you were just re-elected last year at the last federal election.
That's right. I was re-elected. I'm representative of not just my seat, but also my party, the Liberal National Party, elected in 2010, re-elected 2013, again 2016, and at the last election in 2019.
So we'll get underway with the list of questions I've got for you. You've kind of answered number 3 already, but we'll start with our first one, which is, what denomination do you belong to?
I'm a member of the Anglican Church of Australia. I was actually born into, baptised and confirmed a Roman Catholic, but after a period where I'd sort of my faith lapsed during my 20s, I come back to church, and I came back to the Anglican Church. I got to say, I did a bit of searching for a while, and I had a short sojourn for a few years in Eastern Orthodoxy, but did eventually come back to settle in the Anglican Church, which, like the Lutheran Church, I guess, and the Lutheran Communion, you could call it, has a large sort of degree of difference between the different parishes and congregations that exist, between the different ministers and their sort of particular flavour of Lutheranism. Well, there's particular flavours of Anglicanism as well. I belong, obviously, having gone over to Eastern Orthodoxy, to probably the more high church end of the Anglican Church, the one that is more spiritual and biblically orthodox as well.
Cool. So you guys have the real presence in the Lord's Supper and stuff like that?
In the yes, not all Anglicans believe the same thing. I guess that's one thing I need to say. But what I believe, and certainly when I go through Brisbane, I attend a church called, or a parish called All Saints on Wickham Terrace, which the joke goes, it's more Catholic than the Vatican. But we do consider ourselves, I guess, Catholic first and foremost. Anglican is the descriptor. And so, yes, in that parish, and my own belief is in the real presence.
I mean, we don't need to go too much into that, but just why I have you here. So you guys have like infant baptism in the Anglicans as well and stuff like that as well?
Yes.
Cool.
I think that in the main that most Anglicans would agree or believe in infant baptism, yes.
And coming from a Lutheran, I was just interested in, well, it's Anglicans, but specifically the Anglicans you go to, coming from Lutheranism. Where do you guys stand on the question of justification by grace and faith?
So I think a lot of this comes into the interpretation, and look, a lot that I see in theological differences, and this dates back to, the very first split, which actually wasn't between the Orthodox and the Catholics. The first split was between the Eastern Orthodox and Catholics, as they were the one then, and the Oriental Orthodox, and it was over the nature of Christ. So when we talk about justification, I am yet to find even a hardcore Catholic that would actually fundamentally disagree with that. And in fact, if you have a look at in just recent times, the Lutheran Church, or at least an element of the Lutheran Church, and the Roman Catholic Church have almost had a bit of a reapproachment on that issue, to actually say that there isn't really a difference here. The difference is in our interpretation of what it actually meant. And I find that in a lot of theological disputes, it really boils down to how someone has interpreted what someone else has said, or misinterpreted what someone else has said. So I think that people in my church would agree with justification by faith and by grace, yes.
I think, I was just going to say with that, because I know like the Lutherans in Australia and the Anglicans have also had some dialogue on a number of issues, and the Lutherans and the Catholics have had a dialogue, and this sticking point with the Lutherans and the Catholics was when it came to justification by faith, both would nod their heads and say, yeah. The problem was that the Lutherans kept making this emphasis on saying you had to say the word faith alone, and the Catholics wouldn't put the word alone there. They wanted to faith and, works and stuff like that. So that was kind of where they kind of stumbled between themselves. But
see, my understanding of that, again, it's in the interpretation, and I can't pretend to speak for all Catholics or even all Anglicans or anything like that, but as the old saying goes, I mean, faith without works is dead, and works without faith is just useless. I mean, there's a lot of good people. That doesn't mean that they're good Christians. And there's a lot of people that profess to be Christians but actually don't present the fruits of that. So the question is, are they, or are they just saying it? Faith and works are intertwined in a way, but ultimately it's faith. It's the faith that drives you to go and do the works. So again, that's why I say I really do think that so many of the theological disputes over the years, some of them actually have very, very strong, they're strongly defined and are strongly opposed on either side. I can understand that. Some of the things, though, like this issue of faith or faith alone, well, I really do think it's come down to interpretation, and that's not to belittle it, but sometimes I stand back from these big theological debates and go, really? Have we argued over that for so long?
Well, I do think, that the Catholics have probably eased up a bit on where they were, from the 1500s between then and now. So, and I was just going to say, you're talking about the relationship of faith and works, there's two important quotes from Martin Luther that I think are always important on the matter. One is actually in the Small Court Articles, which is part of the Lutheran Confessions, so that's the official teachings of the Lutheran Church, where Luther says that if works do not follow faith, then that person's faith is not actually a true faith, and they're not actually really a Christian. And then there's the other one, which is not in the Confessions themselves, but it's a really good quote from Luther. He said, "Faith and works is like fire and heat and light." The fire is the faith, the heat and the light are the works. Fire will always produce light and heat, and so faith will always produce works. So
yes.
What do you say? He goes on and he says, faith does not ask, what do I need to do?
Indeed.
Faith just does before it even needs to ask the question.
Mm-hmm. And, we go from disputes like that where I think that, to me, even the most hardcore Catholic or Orthodox would probably not disagree with that sentiment. So then you get to disputes around things like the Eucharist and the nature of the Eucharist, and you talked about the real presence before. Can I ask you a question? Because I've been to a Lutheran church, I've known Lutheran pastors, and when I went in for the first time, I remember thinking, wow, this is very Catholic. Actually, that's the number one thing I thought. This is very Catholic. I was surprised that there wasn't too much of a difference between services that I've known and the service that I attended. How do Lutherans in general see the Eucharist? Do they have differing views, or is there a conformed view?
So with historic Lutheranism, I'm going to make the point of historic Lutheranism because with some of the more modern churches, like you mentioned you went into a Lutheran church and it looked very Catholic, that would probably be a more traditional Lutheran churches. There's plenty of Lutheran churches where you go to now, even in Australia, where you'd be like, you feel like you're walking into Hillsong by going in there rather than walking into a Catholic church.
Same with Anglican.
So some of those churches, I can't guarantee where they are, but generally the historic stance of the Lutheran Church is we've always believed in the real presence. There was the big famous debate between Luther and Zwingli at Marburg in the 1500s, I forget the exact year, where Luther, I can't remember if he carved it into the table or just got a piece of chalk or something and wrote on the table, but he wrote down the Latin version of "This is my body," and he just kept pointing to the word "is," or I think it's "est" in the Latin. He's just like, "Is" means "is," and that's it. And every time Zwingli would try and come up with some argument, he'd just go, "Is," and just that's it. The biggest debate between Lutherans, and I don't know if you guys have this in Anglicanism, you might, is the consecration versus reception debate. Yeah. And so what this was, and this was actually an early debate in Lutheranism because Martin Luther and people like Martin Chemnitz and a lot of those guys were consecrationists, but Philip Melanchthon, who was like the second in command after Luther, he held to receptionism.
Which is basically, the description of that is the priest consecrates the elements, as in the bread and wine that becomes the body and blood, and that is when they've become the body and blood of Christ. And the receptionism is when you receive them in faith, it is then the body and blood. And the interesting thing about Anglicanism is that there's a variety of views. Even within the high church area, I think most would believe in the consecration, but there would be some that would believe it is in the reception. So I think that ultimately the Orthodox say it's a mystery. They don't delve into it. They don't ask the questions about it. And I think it was a theologian by the name of John Donne who said in the name of Queen Elizabeth that I can't remember the exact saying, but the Lord spake it and I believe it, was the answer. Don't question it.
I've always liked the Orthodox divine mystery because that is fairly similar to Lutheranism. Apart from the consecration reception debate, we've never really done much of an explanation. The most we've ever said is what Luther and them talk about is what we call a sacramental union, which is just trying to say, really it's just saying, the body and blood are united with the bread and wine, in a similar way to how the divine nature of Jesus is united with the human nature of Jesus. Can we explain that? No. We just accept it in faith. And I think probably the reception consecration debate is really the only real one that's taken place between Lutherans, and that's just generally because people say, well, are you saying that the bread on the altar and in the pastor's hand is the body and blood, or is that just bread and wine, then it's only body and blood once you eat it? I think, just talking about this quickly, with Lutherans, the receptionist view has been around since the early days, but it really got picked up a lot more in the 1800s with the Pietist Lutherans, who focused a lot more on individual spirituality and individual works, and so they had a lot more focus on the individual aspect of Holy Communion rather than the broader aspect. So if you've got any more comments there, otherwise we can move on to the next question. So the next question is, how often do you go to church? So are you a frequent attender, once a month, once a year? How often do you go?
Well, lately, like everyone else, it hasn't been in a while. I've been watching it online. Look, I'm a frequent attender, I would say. The thing is that I'm irregular in terms of where I attend. Sometimes it's in Mackay. Sometimes it's in another city that I'm in, like Townsville or Bowen or Brisbane or Canberra sometimes. So I hop about from.
So you get being a politician.
But, it's interesting talking about how long because, I think that's been one of the really I don't want to really dwell on it too much, but in this whole pandemic, it's been one of the things that has been overlooked by a lot of people. It's sort of like, oh, well, church is cancelled, so what? And they haven't thought too much about it. For people who have a Eucharistic Christianity and the service that they attend is Eucharistic, the Eucharist can be the summit of the faith. Needing to gain that sustenance from the body and blood of Jesus is as important for people as daily food. And I think there's been no consideration of that. And so while we've had bottle shops open, we've had churches closed, and they're reopening now, yes, but I think that in retrospect, all of that could have been done a fair bit better.
We'll move on to the next question, which you have answered, but if you want to mention anything more about it, well, we've got it. So question 3 is, what political party do you belong to?
Yeah, the Liberal National Party, of course, and before that, the National Party. That's the answer.
Then we move on to our 4th question. since that was a nice short one. The fourth one is what do you think the relationship is between your Christian values and beliefs and your political values and beliefs?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. So politics can be a dirty business, and this is probably answering half of the question. So because it can be a dirty business, because it's very much involves the ego when you're trying to get elected, and garnering votes, because it involves compromise, because it involves the cut and thrust of political debate, which can descend really into just name calling and arguments and political bashing. Basically, you have to pull yourself up a lot and actually think about the purpose for what you're there for. And I find when, like in all walks of life, when you get too proud in this game, you end up having a fall, and that's a correction. And that happens to a lot of politicians. So one, it guides me in how I go about, my faith guides me in how I go about doing it, because it helps me to correct myself when I'm wrong. How does it steer me in the right direction? Well, in terms of policy and that sort of thing, I do have a Judeo-Christian outlook on the world and on my country and what should happen in my country, from economics through to social policy, from welfare through to, when we're talking even about trade. So I'm a fairly deep thinker and a fairly wide reader amongst all of these issues, and I try to look for great Christian political philosophers, even ones with competing views, so I can synthesize that and make up my own view on things. So that's how it does guide me. It's very difficult, though, very difficult being a Christian in politics. People tend to think that because you're a Christian and you say you're a Christian or you attend church or whatever, that if you do something wrong, you're a hypocrite. Well, show me one person in a church, even the pastor or priest, that hasn't done something wrong or says that they haven't done anything wrong in their life, even while they've professed to be a Christian. And I'll tell them, well, you've just done something wrong, you've lied. And it's the easiest accusation you can get in politics being a Christian. When you slip up, they say, oh, look, you're a hypocrite. No more than a person who's an atheist and a humanist, actually. But that's the lot, I guess, that Christians have in the public square. These days, it's very, very, not just post-Christendom, but we've got a culture in the public space that is very, very anti-Christian. And I make no bones about that, anti-Christian.
I do agree with your point there that, you mess up as a Christian, people like to jump on you as a hypocrite, which goes to show that they don't actually understand the concept of saint and sinner, that we are saints, but we're also fallen saints at the same time.
Well, someone said once that the church, isn't a haven for the saints, it's a hospital for the sinners. And, that's why I go to church, to learn, to understand, to be corrected, and to go back out in the world and try again, try harder to meet the ideal. And the ideal is Jesus Christ. And I've got to be honest, I'm never going to meet that ideal. So, I'll go throughout my life being a failure in terms of a Christian, because I'm never going to meet the ideal of Jesus Christ. Not in this world anyway.
Cool. So we'll move on to our next question, which is, what do you think is the most important part of Christianity?
It's that what I've just said, actually. And it was interesting. I knew the question was coming because we'd talked earlier, but I thought that's a question I don't have the answer for. And I actually just said it. The most important part of Christianity is what the Eastern Orthodox call theosis. And that is becoming like Christ. I think it was it Thomas Kempis that wrote The Imitation of Christ? But in every different denomination, I see an element of this. Catholicism has The Imitation of Christ, said to be the second most read book in Catholicism beyond the Bible. In Orthodoxy, it's theosis. I've read recently an evangelical book called Union with Christ. I'm not sure whether Lutherans have this, whether Martin Luther made statements. I'm sure he would have made statements around.
I think the Baptist term, which I'm fine with, is like progressive sanctification.
Yes.
I think what Lutherans have talked about is, and I don't know if Luther himself came up with this term or just one of the early Lutherans, is we talk about horizontal and vertical righteousness. And so horizontal righteousness is that between me and God, God forgives me, he declares me righteous, we're all good. And then there's the vertical righteousness, which is I have to go out among other humans and progress towards becoming a holier person.
Yeah. Well, I don't have this conversation with too many people because a lot of people who I start talking about this, they tend to glaze over or have a bit of dribble coming out the side of their mouth. But, when you think about this really, really, really deep, Jesus Christ is the Alpha and the Omega, which means without beginning and without end. Now, those people who believe that before Jesus was born, was some ghost floating around up in the sky, are in error, I believe anyway. And I think that if you look through Christian theology, there was not, who was there before Jesus was born, or where was Jesus before he was born? No, that's the wrong question. At that point in time, that was the beginning, not just in terms of the beginning as in 0 AD. We think about things temporally, we think about things in terms of earth time. In divine time, which is just so stupid to say because there's no such thing as time in divinity, it's eternal. That point always is and always was from the very, very start. It makes your head explode when you think about it. But that actually means that Jesus was the first man. That actually means that Jesus was the prototype, the person who we should aspire to be. And ever from that point, we've fallen away. So in temporal times, Adam was the first man. In divine time, stupid thing to say, in eternality, I could say, Jesus was the first man, and Jesus was the first and only pure man. And that's, again, why we aspire to become like that. The closer we get to like Jesus, or being like Jesus, is the closer we get to divinity or sanctification or sainthood.
Well, yeah, the New Testament is full of quotes, especially from Paul, but I think even Peter and them have them in their epistles, where Paul says multiple times, imitate Christ, or imitate me as I imitate Christ, or strive to be like Christ. Jesus himself, there's the one account where after he's healed a leper, but then there's the more famous account in John 8 when he's forgiven the woman caught in adultery, which has the famous, he who's without sin cast the first stone. He turns to her then and he says to her, go forth and sin no more. And he actually tells her to, you're forgiven. So, as St. Paul says in Romans 6, we've been forgiven. Therefore, should we keep on sinning that grace may abound? May this never be. We who have died to sin should not live in it anymore. We should strive to live. Now, of course, Paul makes this point that, this side of eternity, as Paul says in Romans 7, that the things I don't want to do, I keep on doing, and the things that I do want to do, I don't end up doing. So he acknowledges that he never lives to be perfect, but that there is this goal for perfection. I don't know what you have in the Anglican Church, but I know, especially as the minister here, when I go through the section in our service for confession absolution, there's the three questions or the three interrogations that are asked, and the first one is, do you repent of your sins? Yes.
Yes.
Do you believe that Jesus has forgiven your sins? And then the third one is, do you strive with the help of the Holy Spirit to lead a holy life?
Yes. I think that there's similar language in certain rituals or services within Anglicanism. Certainly is. Again, different services, there's different words depending on which service you're at. But a similar sort of a message, I guess, and a declaration.
So moving on to our last question, and I may need to explain this a little bit more before you answer, but the question number 6 is, in regards to your Christian beliefs, what do you think is the most crucial matter in Australian politics? And the reason why I add the trying to think of the word now,
preface.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the word quantifying or qualifying word, something along that.
Yep.
That it's in regards to your,
there you go. Yep.
in regards to your Christian beliefs, because you personally may think that maybe, I don't know, immigration is the most important political issue, but that's your personal opinion.
Yeah.
So what is
Understood.
relating from your Christian worldview do you think is the most important matter in Australian politics at the moment?
Well, there is one that immediately springs to mind, and that is freedom of religion, religious liberty. Without religious liberty, we are doomed. Not just people of Christian faith, the people of all faiths, but society itself. Where goes freedom of religion, so goes freedom in all its guises, because religion, ultimately, religio means I confess. It's a confession. It's a belief based in thought. Therefore you're going to freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of thought. You start eroding that principle, you've basically taken away something innate in man, and I don't think any civilization can last beyond that. And so I'm not just talking about freedom of religion within Australia, although I think it's under attack. I think it's severely under attack from radical secularism. I think it's under attack from activist groups that don't like traditional Christian belief. I even think that some progressivist Christians actually undermine religious liberty as well, because they don't like what Orthodox Christians have to say, as in, conservative or traditional Christians, I mean, when I use the word Orthodox. So it is under attack in our own country, but the issue of communist China has been coming up lately, and this isn't just an issue for us. It's an issue right around the world. It's an issue in communist China for sure, where you have a government-imposed department, a board of religious affairs that actually goes in and monitors what the church has said. They've actually taken out one of the commandments, the 10 commandments. Over there's the 9 commandments. So they've censored the Bible, and what they've taken out is, I'm the Lord thy God, you shall have no other gods before me, because the Chinese Communist Party and perhaps Xi Jinping thinks of himself as the deity there in China. So, of course, that's going out because the state the party has to come first and foremost, even above God. We have a look at religious liberty right across the world in places like Africa, Nigeria, where there is just wholesale slaughter of Christian communities going on by Muslim insurgents like Boko Haram, through to useful idiots that follow the radical Islamic line in the I think they call them the Fulani tribesmen, which are armed by Islamist terrorists and go out and do the work of Islamist terrorists by shooting up villages of Christians. So we have this persecution of Christians right across the world that is rarely talked about because, in the West, Christianity has been dominant for so long, and so we're seen as the oppressors. How can we be the victims in the politically correct, post-Christian, anti-Christian culture? We're the ones that are ripe for the kicking by the political correctness brigade, but yet actually what we're seeing right around the world in the West, certainly in the public space, Christianity is being pushed out. Religious belief is being restricted to, just thinking it and saying it privately only. It's certainly being clamped down in China, and there's not many people that are speaking out about that. And when have you last seen in the mainstream media anything about the atrocities in Nigeria? So that is the most important issue.
I mean, you point out with the media, I remember a lot of people complaining last year, at least people in the Christian circles complaining that the amount of media coverage that the mosque shooting in New Zealand got, and versus then the fact that it was only like a week or so time, there was like 600 Christians killed in Sri Lanka, and it got, if you're lucky, maybe like 1 or 2 mentions on the news. It was Christian martyrdom. It gets brushed under the rug so much by the media because they just don't care.
Let me tell you what it does boil down to. It's even worse than that, because I know, having studied journalism, it's what we call proximity. And there's another word for proximity, I reckon, racism. So New Zealand's close, right? So when we say proximity, it's a close nation. So something happens over there, it's big news here in Australia. But if it happened in the US, which isn't close, it would also be big news in Australia. It's because it's a white country. If it happens in Southeast Asia, if it happens in Africa, if it happens in, an Eastern Asian country like Sri Lanka, we don't hear about it in our media. And so it's got that double impact because it's, they're not of the same culture as ours, race, you could say. But I think that there's also a fair bit of, it's a tax against Christians, so why would we report it? Doubly bad, anti-Christian and also racist as far as I'm concerned.
So that's our 6 questions, but I might, just before we finish up, I've got an extra question just for you and just for this panel.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because you have your own podcast, which is Conservative One, which I've recently been listening to after I listened to Matt Canavan. He posted the episode that you did with him on his podcast.
Yes.
And so then I thought I'd check your one out as well. And I would recommend your podcast to any of my listeners.
Oh, thank you.
Because what I find most interesting is for a political podcast, at least the first 2 episodes you had, where you had Kurt Melberg, I think his name is how you pronounce his last name.
Yep.
On the first episode, and then I forget his name, but you had some Anglican, I think now Catholic priest, layman. His circumstances a bit weird on the second podcast.
His name's Gavin Ashenden. Actually, he was the former chaplain to the Queen.
Ah, yes, I do remember that. That was on the episode. What I found most interesting about listening to those episodes was that, this is a political podcast, and yes, you do talk about politics, but you're also not shy about Christianity and talking about theology. And I thought it was interesting listening to the show that most times I was listening to those, at least the first 2 episodes, I'm like, I feel like I'm just listening to a standard theological Christian podcast here. Like, if I didn't know this was about politics, I probably wouldn't even have realised this was a political show. Like, I mean, even just listening to it, I go, if I didn't know you were a member of parliament, I'd just assume you're some kind of, pastor or theologian or something like that. So I really enjoyed listening to those first few episodes where it's like, oh yeah, so it's politics and it's faith. Kind of like my show.
That's good. Well, I should have you on my show at some point.
That'd be fun. I'd enjoy that. The question I got for you then is the question that you seem to ask all your guests at the end of the episode, which is, if you were dictator of Australia for a day, what would you do?
Dictator. I ask him if I was Prime Minister for the day, but okay, if I was dictator for the day. I
like to add dictator because then you get to do whatever you want.
If I was dictator, what I would do, if we're just for my country, right, at religious liberty, I'd enshrine it into the Constitution, never able to be taken out, as long as what you are saying or doing is an incitement to violence against anyone else. I'm talking about direct incitement, not imagined. It doesn't matter what you say if it offends someone else. It doesn't matter what you say if someone doesn't like it. I would just absolutely enshrine religious liberty and freedom of speech, I guess, in the Constitution, never to be taken out, even by referendum, forever, full stop.
So if anyone would like to find your podcast, where can they find it?
It's www.conservative1.com, conservative with ONE at the end, or you can type that into whatever your podcast host platform is, Apple or Google or Spotify or whatever, Conservative One.
And before we wrap up the show, do you have any final messages about faith or politics that you would like to leave for the listeners?
Well, look, the only thing that I really would say is that I think that more Christians do need to get involved. We vacate the public space. We basically leave it over to other people who, there are a lot of people out there that, as I said, that are anti-Christian, rabidly secularist to the point of being very antagonistic towards Christianity and faith in general. So we should step up. I don't necessarily mean join a political party. I don't necessarily mean run for parliament. I've got to say, Reverend Jake, you, in what you are doing as a pastor, as a minister of a congregation, you are actually in a position to change hearts and minds, which, quite frankly, for Christ, which is the ultimate good, not for political purposes. But even changing hearts and minds and steering people in the right direction leads to a change in society for the better, I think. And that is more than I can do as a politician, I've got to say, ever, actually. So there is something each and every one of us can do in our particular walk of life. And ultimately, you can change society by changing hearts and minds, one person at a time.
Well, thank you for coming on for our very first episode of Faith and Politics. I hope the listeners have enjoyed this new style of podcast that I'm trialling at the moment. Then I hope I can get some other politicians on to talk about faith and politics, and I hope the listeners can enjoy that as well. So thank you, and goodbye, and God bless.
Thanks, and God bless you too, Jake.